Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Fall 2021 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture, here at the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History here at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. As always, with me is AAS Library Assistant Amanda Kondak. Today's guest is Corinna Zeltsman, who in a few moments will share a presentation on her new book, Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th-Century Mexico, published by the University of California Press earlier this year. Before introducing today's guest, I want to briefly introduce you to the Society. AAS was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library, learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Now I would like to turn things over to Amanda, who will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today. Amanda?
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. The chat function is open, so please send your comments to everyone. And throughout the presentation, I will be posting additional information and links in the chat relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIBAC. And you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat window. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you have any questions for our speaker during or after their presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you will also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon, and we will answer these at the end of our program. And finally, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this program and we'll be posting it on our website and YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone, and Kevin, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. And now on to our program. Corinna Zeltsman is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University. She is the author of Ink Under the Fingernails, Printing Politics in 19th-Century Mexico, on which she is presenting today. Her research on the history of printing and the book, political culture, and labor have received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Social Science Research Council. Trained as a letterpress printer, she is also a fellow in the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. With that, I welcome Corinna Zeltsman.
Hi, thanks so much. I want to thank you so much, Kevin, for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor to be able to share my research and be part of the program in the history of the book at the American Antiquarian Society. And I want to also thank Amanda for helping to organize everything and to the audience for coming out today to hear about printing politics in 19th century Mexico. So I'll speak a little bit about the origins of my project and why it's important to study this history in Mexico in particular. And then I will talk a little bit about some of the main conclusions and focus of the book. But given the forum, the history of the American Antiquarian Society, its founder, I want to try to bring everyone into a 19th century Mexican printing shop to look at some of the political dynamics and social imaginaries that flourished there. So sort of a slice of the research project that I'll be sharing with you towards the end of the talk. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the origins of the project. It's very much a reflection of my personal trajectory as well as my scholarly experiences. I grew up around printing stuff. Both of my grandfathers were printers, so I kind of grew up not only surrounded by ephemera and books and things like that, but also type and composition sticks that were lying around the house and things like that. So I kind of stumbled into the world of letterpress printing, conditioned by those experiences. As a young adult, where I worked, I learned at the Center for Book Arts in New York how to print, and got involved with that kind of stuff, bookbinding and artist books. And at the same time, in college, I was getting into Latin American studies via language, right, via studying Spanish, and taking classes in literature, history, politics. And so after I graduated, I ended up working in New York, back at the Center for Book Arts. And I kept sort of stumbling and coming back into the question of where Latin America fit into the narratives of printing history and book history that I was encountering. And I really wasn't seeing much about it in the institutions and the spaces that I was interacting with and participating in. So I sort of went back to graduate school some years later with the idea of trying to put these two these two interests together. And my research in Latin America informed the kind of questions I asked about print. So why did I end up focusing on Mexico? Latin America is, of course, a really large and diverse place, but Mexico, and in particular Mexico City, really stood out for me as the site that would be the best place to start research. As many of you probably know, it's the site of the oldest printing tradition in the Western Hemisphere. But there are no monographic studies about Mexico's printing trades published in English. Now, there's a flourishing scholarship in Spanish about print, printers, print culture. And one of the things that the book does, I hope, is to introduce Anglophone audiences to some of this literature through footnotes and citations. But what happens, given this reality, is that it feeds, I think, into narratives that privilege the US as a kind of inheritor of the European printing traditions, while minimizing the multiple trajectories of print and printing in the Americas. So my work, I think of it as kind of contributing to our efforts to pluralize our understanding of the many trajectories of printing. And the press was introduced in 1539. It was part of a Spanish project of colonization and evangelization. And over time, it becomes really central to governance, to religious culture, the formation of intellectual communities in Mexico. And, I just selected two objects here to give you a sense of how, print was used in the colonial era. On the right, you see an example of a decree that would have been circulated around, print was used to promulgate official directives from above. It was also used among scholarly communities. And on the left, you see a much sort of small, simple prayer book. It was used, essential in popular religious devotion. So just a few examples of the multiple ways that print function in colonial society. And it's important to understand the geographies of printing in colonial Mexico, because they reveal a lot about the political and economic context in which printers worked. Mexico City was really the unrivaled center of publishing throughout the entire colonial era and into the present, I would say. As the capital city, it was this hub of power and wealth, and printing shops really clustered in the central core, close to the halls of power. And I've highlighted in red, the cathedral here, the viceregal palace, the municipal hall, and this is the central square. Individuals who wanted to publish needed approval from religious and royal officials, but church and state patrons were also really important customers of Mexico City printers. So what you really have is a system that emphasizes consensus and collaboration. And the map gives an idea. The X's represent printers that were actually active in the 19th century. So the map gives you a sense of how even after independence, printing shops continue to cluster in the center of the city, reflecting the close kind of economic connections between printers and official patrons. So colonial era printers, like the one that you see here, really highlighted those connections, their close connections to royal and religious patrons. This is a portrait of Manuel Valdez, who was a prominent colonial printer And it was commissioned by his son upon his death, and it describes Valdez as the royal printer. Right in the description on the bottom, it highlights his special title, which was a reflection of his privileges. And it's interesting if you think about when this painting was issued in 1814. Mexico is in the middle of its independence wars, where you have insurgents fighting to overthrow the viceroyalty, the viceregal government, and nevertheless, in the middle of this war, you have a printer commissioning this royal portrait of his father that emphasizes those loyalist credentials. And it's so, this painting is kind of a performance of loyalism in a context where printers really depended on official patronage to sustain their businesses. And Valdez was the publisher. Another thing that the little dedication or the text at the bottom of the painting explains is that Valdez is the publisher or the author of the Gaceta de Mexico, which was the official news vehicle in the late 18th century. And he had an exclusive privilege to print the news. So, these connections to powerful authorities helped to kind of cordon the market and were really important for colonial printers' economic strategies. So all of this changed as Spanish rule began to unravel in the early 19th century and Mexico achieved independence in 1821. Independence brought pretty significant changes to the world of printing. The government transformed. Mexican officials embraced Republican forms of government. They ratified a constitution and they established freedom of the press. Of course, you have the emergence of political factions, and each of these seize upon broadsides, pamphlets, newspapers to battle for power, right, on a new field, this emerging field that I call printing politics. This field where, of political debate conducted through the printed word or printed image. And for officials and intellectuals who are trying to kind of create the new nation, printing takes on a new symbolic importance, a new and strategic importance as a kind of transformative technology that could be used for all sorts of things, for shaping public opinion, for checking government power, educating a nation that had largely not had access to formal schooling. And, it's reflected, this sort of hopeful vision of print is reflected in the sort of one of the signature legislation pieces about press freedom, where lawmakers describe the press as really transcendent ability to, quote, spread the seed of virtue to all corners, establish the principles of justice, and make nations happy with the immense benefits of civilization. So if anyone who wanted to use the press, of course, had to confront what I call the politics of printing, which is the gritty pragmatics of actually running a printing business in 19th century Mexico. The wars of independence had really devastated Mexico's economy. Only a small minority of Mexicans could afford to pay for printed materials like newspapers or political pamphlets. And printers had to, they also had to lay out pretty large sums to acquire equipment and supplies, things like presses, paper, type, all of this had to be imported from abroad. So it's a pretty challenging economic environment, and printers embrace politics as a sort of central part of their economic strategy. And they emerge as these semi-autonomous political figures who sustain their businesses through this opaque mixture of political patronage, private commissions, and editorial ventures. So they become these really important figures in an emerging boisterous world of political debate. And as such, they gained considerable influence in politics, but they also faced a lot of criticism and sometimes outright scorn from social superiors, people who dismiss them as uneducated and therefore unqualified to engage as full participants in the public sphere. And we can see the negative judgments that elites had towards printers in this emergence of a kind of dual characterization of the printer as either a partisan hack who just prints whatever and his affiliates, his patrons tell him, or an unprincipled mercenary who will print anything for profit. Printers get kind of stuck between this rock and hard place. So all of Mexico's governments across the political spectrum embrace the liberal guarantee of press freedom, but their rhetorical commitment coexists with constant efforts to tame the rollicking, boisterous world of printing politics. So officials frequently are cracking down on print communities. They're attempting to regulate printing. One of the strategies that they use to regulate print is to attempt to hold printers legally responsible for controversial texts. And official anxieties over print out of control were exacerbated by the fact that shaky national governments, these governments were pretty shaky and often collapsed or changed administrations midterm. They really depended on Mexico City's printers to publish all of the government's official materials. This had not been the case originally. The government tried to create a national government printing office, but it collapsed after a few years. And so if we want to conceptualize this world, I think about the state officials kind of joining with their political rivals, with religious officials, with journalists, printing shop owners, and this really diverse cast of artisans and workers to compete over the ability to use and to command print production. So my book centers struggles over printing to shed light on Mexico's 19th century history, the history of state formation, and to better understand the political culture powered by printing in the post-independence era. And by focusing on practices, so the book really focuses on practices and it traces negotiations among printers, officials, authors. I uncovered a pretty surprising range of actors and figured out, from powerful presidents all the way down to these anonymous type compositors, I discovered that all of these characters really participated in conflicts and contests associated with state formation. So really one of the central arguments of the book is that we can't understand the history of press freedom in Mexico without taking into account its laboring and material dimensions. Lawmakers continually try to control printing as part of their ongoing efforts to set limits around public speech throughout the entire 19th century. And the book really traces these shifting strategies for a 100-year span. It includes, it ranges from what I mentioned earlier, printers trying to hold printers as responsible parties for controversial imprints, to, by the late 19th century, you have judges trying to treat printing presses as criminal evidence that could be confiscated as like a bloody knife. So printers, have to confront all of these tactics, and in response, they emerge as legal theorists in their own right, who argue that you can't have press freedom unless you also have freedom for printers. So they try to kind of reconfigure press freedom as printers' freedom. And what the book does is to trace this lengthy conversation from before independence to the Mexican Revolution of 1910, when printers actually achieved a partial victory. The stakes of the conflicts that I'm talking about were high. Government officials and political elites were concerned that unregulated printing would provoke political unrest, would undermine morality and piety, and it would potentially erode the very foundations of the social order. And the painting that I've been talking over for a while now, from mid-19th century Puebla, attests to the anxieties of elites with this scene of tavern reading. You have this group assembled in a tavern, in a pulqueria, where they're drinking pulque. They're probably drunk, at least the central figure looks pretty drunk, and it's sort of mixed company, right? Women and men, hanging out together in these unsavory spaces. You have one figure who's sounding out a political cartoon for his fellows. So it's sort of a space where print, literate and illiteracy, the boundaries of orality and print are kind of blurring. And for the paintings like this would have hung in the homes of elite patrons, where they could kind of observe this scene of popular behavior from a safe distance and draw moral conclusions, right, about encouraging them to regulate and intervene in this world, and kind of warning about the dangers of print out of place. These do not appear to be the kinds of sober citizens that you want to be participating in political life, yet they have access to these. These are actually real. There's a wonderful study where the author reveals the way these are real political cartoons that and political newspapers that circulated in the 19th century that they're consuming, right? So there's also a kind of counter reading to the image, which is, the idea of everyday life as this democratizing arena where print is meeting unanticipated audiences and generating conversation through really intimate networks of exchange. And that points to another dimension of my book, which is to try to understand the social dynamics, the urban networks, and I would argue the clientelistic practices that shaped production and consumption in a society where really few people could read. And I think printing comes to refract the fears as well as the hopes of a cross-section of society. So it's not just politics that are churning here, right? Behind the scenes of literate production, social ferment and contestation were also churning. And printing shops themselves hosted a really wide range of actors with diverse levels of education and skill, whose activities blurred the boundaries between manual and intellectual labor, especially if we think about the printing shop as holistically, right, as a space that really brings a lot of different kinds of people together. Across the differences in job types and education, printing shop inhabitants shared some common aspirations and indeed competed for social status via the printed word. So you have printing shop owners who struggled to gain access to a world that was dominated by educated elites who disdained manual labor. Printers also had to contend, of course, with the liberal lawmakers who thought that they should act as mute extensions of their presses through which the will of the author should freely flow. And you see the sort of ways in which authorship gets constructed as kind of individual character, have its individual character is strengthened by press freedom legislation that attempts to regulate or to cast printers as these kind of neutral machine extensions so that authorship could be, identifiable and authors' freedoms could be guaranteed. And so printers had to kind of deal with the realities of whether they wanted to be identified with this kind of mindless, conceptualization as presses, unthinking presses. And journalists who might have had formal educations and had access to a public literary voice were also kind of constantly complaining about the directives of the printing shop owners who paid them notoriously low wages and often told them what to write about. Print shop workers, especially type compositors, dreamed about having their own voices reproduced on the printed page. And this satirical representation of a Mexico City type compositor pokes fun at this dream. This is an image from Los Mexicanos Pintados por Sí Mismos, which is a pretty influential work that features social types and includes little vignettes about each individual. And here we see El Cajista, the compositor, who's depicted as this social climbing working class dandy. He's wearing a top hat on the job. And if you read the accompanying vignette, it talks all about the ways that he intervenes in textual production and, threatens the autonomy of the author. He is really distracted, dreaming about his own social life and his own aspirations. And in the process, he takes what's supposed to be a social announcement and he does a bunch of typos, makes typos, and he turns it into a funeral announcement. So his social aspirations produce the downfall of respectable society. He kills off the elite with bad printing. Printing shop work was collaborative, but as satire like this points out, it was also shaped by social hierarchies and tensions as well as aspirations. Now, printers challenged the assumption that their associations with manual labor disqualified them as thinkers. And I argue that we should really think about printers as a kind of a particular category of intellectuals who intervened in broader political and cultural debates precisely because of their unique working relationship to words. The owners of printing businesses were visible participants in legal debates about press freedom, as I mentioned before, but they were also intervening in conversations about taste, politics, and national identity as publishers, which of course in the 19th century Mexico, publishers and printers are kind of overlapping categories. Type compositors too embraced elements of liberal discourse over the 19th century. They celebrate with a kind of twist, right? A kind of printerly twist. They celebrated informal education and hard work as avenues for self-improvement. They did not often have the opportunity to take a public voice in print, but they did seize special opportunities to display their knowledge and ideas, like for example, a religious celebration or the birth of an employer. These two examples of really rare 1820s era ephemera on the left show two examples of that kind of, taking opportunities to show off your facility with language, your mastery of language, and also kind of your mastery of form, right? The poem on the left is this lovely flower that's been painstakingly set in type, and anyone who's done typesetting knows that it's harder, or composing type knows that it's harder to create rounded forms. Takes ingenuity, takes little time. So they're sort of showing off their dual mastery of skill and their facility with language, playing with that, the relationship between form and content. And on the left or on the right, you see an example of an issue of a worker newspaper. They were, compositors and printers were really leading voices in the urban worker press that sprang up in the 1820s in Mexico. And part of that is because everybody who had a mutualist organization needed to publish a newspaper to be taken seriously. And that meant you needed to know somebody who had access to a press, right? So they had this sort of outside representation in this world of urban mutualism. So one of the contributions of my book is to explore the ways that printers claimed textual production for themselves and how they elaborated creative and craft-inflected formulas that demanded recognition for their intellectual activities. It was common for writers and journalists to embrace the paradigm of romantic individualism as a way to boost their status. And I talked a little bit about legal ideas of the individual author, but also kind of culturally. But printers in their own writings elaborated a different kind of vision. They reimagined intellectual production as this kind of composite and collaborative activity. So I want to explore this angle of my research in a little more depth by sharing with you one of the more interesting documents that I uncovered in the course of my research. And here you can see pages from an unpublished type catalog, which was created in 1877 by workers in Mexico's national government printing shop. And the government printing shop in the 1870s was this really important space of intellectual production in Mexico. It was located inside the National Palace. Like I mentioned before, there had been efforts to create a national printing office in 1823, one of the first acts of government, in fact, but it had closed by the late 1820s. By the 1860s, so in the 1860s, Mexico was occupied by French troops of Napoleon III. He installed the Habsburg monarch Maximilian on a Mexican throne. And Maximilian had reestablished this government print shop, right? He had kind of made it part of his information policy. But after Maximilian is defeated by the Republican troops of Benito Juarez, Juarez's Republican government rededicates, seizes all the materials and rededicates the printing shop and starts to issue this outpouring of materials intended to mold the nation's cultural outlook, build a liberal nation state, promote liberal citizenship and patriotic history, and encourage economic development. So you have, this massive production or very diverse production of works about trade, like trade treaties, plans for infrastructure projects and commerce, scholarly work on geography, on political economy, medicine, public health, military tactics and textbooks, right? Periodicals for children, legal textbooks, a whole range of materials. So it's really this a hub of intellectual production. And, these projects were temporarily disrupted in 1876, about 7 years after the founding of the printing shop, when one of the heroes from the anti-French struggle, General Porfirio Diaz, seized power in a coup and replaced the printing shop staff with his own people. So there's this bureaucratic reshuffling that happens when Diaz comes to power. And in this, after you have a political reshuffling, you need to have the bureaucratic accounting. And out of that moment, compositors produced this document, which they presented to their superiors in what I think is an extremely limited run. I mean, this, as far as I know, is the only surviving copy, but I don't think many were issued. And I think that the very small circulation of this printed document gets us thinking a little bit about the performative aspects of printing. We often talk about dissemination, diffusion, but it was submitted along with like a printed report from the director of the printing shop who, he took you usually would just write a report and send it to your boss, but he took the time to have it converted into print. So there's obviously a kind of performative dimension to how printing is being used in this case. A document like this is ostensibly made to display the type collections of the print shop, and it presents us with a lot of textual content, right? It's made, which you can see here through this wide-ranging group of references to people and places, includes aphorisms, witticisms, and you'll recognize for sure the names of familiar individuals. Indeed, it's a catalog that's sort of a compendium of heroes, especially political heroes, but also cultural heroes, heroes associated with cultural production. And it's a really interesting space because it converges the living and the dead, right? There's live heroes, but there's long dead heroes, as well as Mexican and European heroes. So it collapses time and it collapses space in this particular document. And I thought about this, I sort of treated this catalog as a map and used it to reconstruct the political and the intellectual worldview of the printing shop's anonymous compositors. And what I found is a community that is deeply nationalistic in its preoccupations, but also very invested in global political questions, specifically, the global political struggle associated with the rise of liberalism, and especially liberalism in the context of the Romance language speaking world, regions, Italy, France, and Spain, which, if you think about the time period, this is exactly when Republican forces in those places are still sort of struggling against reactionary monarchies, right? So the document kind of is thinking about that political struggle, and it establishes Mexico on the leading edge of the liberal wave, right? This liberal victory, and claims a kind of privileged position for Mexico as an inheritor of a Western tradition that dates back to classical Greece and Rome. It's interesting, it's a very Eurocentric document, which I think reveals the cultural biases of its makers, who are really steeped in this world of literate culture. And they pretty much, they're pretty silent on persistent inequalities related to race. It also reveals the printing shop's imaginary as very male dominated. There are very few references to women. And I'd be, happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. It's, women are very much present in this world. But if you think about in printers' imaginaries, they're absent from all the print shop myths. And the only place they appear is in the personification of the press itself, which is referred to, in poems, in newspaper articles, as a spiritual patron like the Virgin Mary as the printing press, as a daughter, a silent, obedient daughter who takes lessons from the printer, or as the sort of spouse, the nurturing spouse who accompanies the political struggle, right? The printers in their political struggle. So real women are sort of marginalized from this social imaginary. But the document doesn't just place Mexico on the leading edge of liberalism. It also establishes the printers and the compositors in particular as privileged interpreters within this exclusive world that they are constructing through the document. And I interpreted this document alongside writings that were printers published in the worker press, where the theme of printers' hidden labor and their unrecognized contributions to intellectual life emerge as a really central preoccupation and central thread. At the top, I'll just walk you through the references. The top is the acting interim president of Mexico, and then you have Protasio Tagle, who's the head of the secretary of the interior, who's the immediate the bureaucratic supervisor of the print shop, and then this sort of demand which breaks out of the frame to sort of proclaim that the printing shop is in a terrible state. Talent is worth more than instruction, which is sort of a play on liberal ideas about education as a pathway, formal education as the pathway to social advancement. Here they talk about talent, right? The sort of natural, what you're born, a sort of dig on this idea of education as advancement, right? Liberty, or a celebration of sort of informal abilities, right? liberty is a common cause. Luther, Calvin, Savonarola, which is a sort of mashup of religious reformers, if you will. And printing is light, of course, the Enlightenment equation of printing and enlightenment. So when they choose talent over instruction, they grasp at freedom, they equate printing with enlightenment, they're essentially casting themselves as the heroes in their own story. And it almost seems like the printers, the compositors are equating their own efforts with the work of these reformers, right? Luther, Calvin, Savonarola, like they're ostensibly requesting better material working conditions, right? Or better material conditions in the printing shop, but they're also questing after recognition within the exclusive world that they facilitated through their labors. So sources like this one, which allow us to interpret the worldview of the printing shop, reveal how printers took opportunities to engage in literate production in order to reimagine the social order. In these narratives, printers recast the printing shop as a space not simply of gritty labor where workers took their cues from educated social superiors, but as spaces of intellectual expression and social transformation in their own right. It shows how printers tried to scrub the ink from under their fingernails to gain recognition as the creators, not just the silent mechanical reproducers of political and intellectual life.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
For those who are in attendance, the Q&A is open, so you are welcome to submit questions for Corinna now. I would like to kind of get things started a little bit while we await for those to arrive. At the very beginning of the talk, of course, you mentioned Isaiah Thomas, founder of AAS. Isaiah Thomas's History of Printing in America, which was published in 1808, actually rightly begins with a section called Printing in Spanish America, acknowledging Mexico City as the origin of printing in the Americas. I should also note that for those that have the 1970 edition, that section is completely omitted from that edition. So something to think about and maybe talk about in a little while. But Thomas's observations and criticisms are really directed, of Mexican printing are directed towards the amount of control that both government and church have over the press. Now, he does actually say that a lot of the works produced from Mexico were not badly executed, which is a huge compliment from the master printer. And he does later acknowledge numerous works that are non-religious or governmental in nature. Histories, morals, grammars, classics were all well done. But I wanted to kind of focus on his observations and criticisms and actually ask how true they may have been. So how much control did the government and the Catholic Church, maybe more specifically, have over printers over the course of the 19th century? And how did printers try to achieve autonomy from both state and church authorities?
Yeah, it's great. It was great to look back at Thomas's work and think about his, he's sort of working within a certain framework and suspicious of the Catholic this sort of has this sort of Black legend idea of the Catholic control over thought and print. And, and it's interesting, in some ways, 19th century officials also, or at least reformers, radical and liberal reformers sort of use those characterizations themselves as a political weapon to chip away at a religious power and religious authority. By the when Thomas is writing, you do have, of course, censorship mechanisms still in place, but after, the degree to which those really fit his vision of this sort of total control is, that's, I think, been pretty dismantled by scholars of the colonial era. And I think, I talk about kind of cultures of consensus. Certainly, print is not the place that you would have gone to take issue with the viceroy. That wouldn't have happened. And there are certainly other ways that Mexicans could express critical opinions through, writing, through rumor and gossip and all sorts of other ways. But by the 19th century, you have freedom of the press, but there's a lot of, with instability comes insecurity and a lot of efforts to sort of crack down on printers. The church, interestingly enough, does retain some formal power over religious materials in the Constitution. So there's an attempt to kind of construct a Catholic liberalism, right? A way to maintain. So, you don't have religious freedom in the beginning of the 19th century. You have a Catholic nation. And so what does that mean practically, right? The church is supposed to have, editors are supposed to bring religious works to the church for prior censorship. One of my chapters in the book explores the way that printers who are radical printers try to kind of force the issue and change that relationship and dismantle the church's power over any kind of print materials. I explore this really interesting case of the printing of a French Gothic thriller called Mysteries of the Inquisition, which I'm sure many people in the audience will recognize that genre of the mysteries printing, which is about like underworld, cabals of power. And it was part of this sort of radical liberal project to dismantle church authority. And so I explore all of the ways in which church and state officials have to kind of confront this challenge presented by partisan printer activists who are trying to force the issue, right? To create scenarios where the church and the state will come into a conflict over a particular printed work, which then doesn't quite produce a resolution, but it forces the issue further down the road. And eventually, the church and state will part ways. And after a civil war, the church loses its power over printed materials. And the question of the state trying to establish its control is, it's a really ongoing effort by, especially when officials feel like they're losing power, they tend to crack down as a kind of knee-jerk reaction against printers. And the book really looks at this long kind of negotiation between printers and political leaders of all partisan stripes. So one of the things that unites liberals and conservatives across the board is their, they have different theoretical and philosophical approaches, but they all kind of crack down on print communities in one way or the other. So the book sort of traces the efforts by printers to free the press, freeing themselves, insulating themselves from government crackdowns, which finds expression in the 1917 Constitution, which remains in effect in Mexico to this day.
Fantastic, thank you. While we're talking about the Catholic Church, we have a question from Sandra Mendiola, who says, "Wonderful presentation. Congratulations on your new book. As the Day of the Dead is approaching in Mexico, could you tell the author, could the author tell us a bit more about the broadside that she discusses in her book about the Cavalera de la Prensa or other cavalleras, please? Were different printers creating the drawings and others creating the poems? Thank you."
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Can I share my screen really quickly? I have let me see if
Absolutely.
I can. I have this in one of my slides, just in case. So I end the book with an examination briefly of this broadside. And many of you have probably seen, right, Posada's illustrations of the well-known artist, illustrator, Jose Guadalupe Posada, who was active in Mexico City in the late 19th century. And these broadsides, which were issued in commemoration of Day of the Dead every year, they're really interesting as material objects because they get repurposed in so many different ways. I didn't really follow that thread down the rabbit hole in this book, but there are multiple versions of this, even this particular Calavera de la Prensa. I think there are multiple uses. This illustration, which features the publisher, Posada's publisher, Antonio Venegas Arroyo, has another version that goes with a different poem, which is making fun of him as an editor. It's like the Calavera of the popular editor or the popular publisher. So they were very much kind of like mix and match productions that lived on like after the author, the illustrator's death. I think this one was printed after Posada was already dead. So, and you can see by the state of the print that the block has been printed many, many times, the various blocks, and repaired and things like that. And there's really fascinating studies that get into the nitty gritty of how Posada actually worked and the way he creates this aesthetic of like ye old, printing, but he's using kind of contemporary photomechanical reproduction techniques to make a faux old vision of print. And I don't really know how to answer, who did what. And that's one of always the kind of the fun things about studying the printing shop, is because there's so much, they're kind of, in some ways they look like a black box. There's a lot of people inside all working on things, and then the final product comes out. So, especially a shop like this was very artisanal. I don't know if Posada himself wrote poetry, but for sure there's some kind of dialogue at some point, but then also these images start to take on their own life and become part of this repertoire of reprinting, which I think is also a really important component of 19th century print culture, which, other scholars have talked about, but I think really applies in Mexico as well.
Great, thank you. While we're on broadsides, I'd like to actually move on to almanacs now. How do almanacs factor into printing politics in Mexico?
That's a great question, and it's one that my colleague Edward Wright Rios has written about. If you're curious to know about that, he's published a book, Searching for Madre Matiana, that has a whole section on almanac makers in Mexico City. And the almanacs were many printers and some of the more successful printers had their own almanac. Some of them ran for a long time, and people would do it as a money-making operation. They were the anchor was the calendar of saints' days as the sort of anchoring piece that repeats in every genre. But there are some that engage with politics, and there's sort of liberal or conservative sort of angles to the almanacking genre as well. That's not something I talk too much about in the book, but his work is really great for getting into that as well.
Fantastic, thank you. We had several folks, I think you've anticipated one of the questions I had for you regarding women printers, which we've talked about before, but we have several questions asking about women printers in colonial and 19th century Mexico. So could you discuss that a little bit more? There's a couple of specific questions here.
Yeah, I saw someone ask about the viuda de, right? Which is the...
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So women are really part of the world of print production in Mexico from the colonial era to, into the 19th century. In the colonial era, they're most famous because they inherit the presses of their fathers or their spouses, and then they become the new boss of and owner of the printing shop. So their names appear as, they're the printer, in the sense that a printer is an owner. And one of the more common debates is like, did the women really operate the presses? But I actually think that question, we focus perhaps too much on the individual the printer as this lone figure, which leads us to miss, I think, a lot of the ways that women were participating in print production in ways that don't get as much recognition. Like in that printing shop that I discussed, the government printing shop, where they produced this type specimen that sort of excludes women from its myth making about the print shop. The lowest paid worker in the print shop is a woman. She's the servant, and she cleans the printing shop. So she's there, I imagine she's there all the time. She's cleaning up after the guys. She's cleaning up after the mule that, turned the press in the government's printing shop in the National Palace. Kind of wild to think about the mule clopping around in there. But, she doesn't get sort of recognition. Women were also really important in the political kind of negotiations that went on behind the scenes when printers were imprisoned. Sometimes everyone would get sent to prison, including workers and wives. So there's some cases I found in the archives of women getting carted off to prison because they were in the print shop. And women also played a really important role petitioning the government to release their family members from prison and to try to keep the presses running when the male printer had been scooped up for some, harassed, to sort of pressure them to stop doing whatever they were doing. So they're, really their active role in keeping business running suggests to me that they're really part of the family business, right? As well as the workers who, if you think about them as the shop servants, are making, and for printers, the image of the printer as clean, right? The not being dirty, keeping your workspace clean, all this is sort of part, and it's parodied in that satire of the typesetter, the cajista, who is, wearing fancy clothes on the job and has this sort of reputation to maintain. Women's labors as cleaning, that care work is what's making that self-presentation possible, right? So I'm actually working on a small piece about this because I didn't address it too directly in the project, but I think it is something that's worth thinking about when we talk about where women fit in printing history. And yeah, there weren't, women were kind of formally excluded from the shop floor. They didn't work as compositors like they did in some other contexts. There are some schools for teaching trade schools by the late 19th century that train women, and they sometimes a newspaper will brag about how this was set all by women, but it's very rare, and it's a sort of strange project because you could learn the skill, but there'd be nowhere to go work after you're done with your program because, women are barred from the shop floor by just informally. And I don't think there's any laws or anything. I just don't think from my evidence that there are many women doing that on a large scale. They are working in binderies and things like that. So it's not like they're not part of the broader trades and the world of work. And I'll stop there.
We had another question about women and perhaps children actually working in print shops doing the binding or coloring. So
I think that is happening. Yeah.
Another question asks about your research and whether or not it explores lithographic printers in Mexico, especially any firms that kept their presses rolling, printing sheet music, genre scenes, historical prints, and the like.
I don't get too much into it. I mean, I think about it in the context of when printers when a lithograph mattered for a political scandal. In one of my chapters, there's a monarchist pamphlet that gets printed by a liberal printer, and it generates this big scandal. And one of the sort of special features of this document, which is just a political pamphlet, is that he includes a lithograph, as part of his kind of emotional appeal, which is quite unusual because lithography is very, fairly expensive. And to put it into a political pamphlet kind of doubles the cost of your output or something. I don't know the economics. We don't have, we're working with really fragmented archives. We don't have like publishers' archives that are complete, that survive, that we can use to reconstruct a complete sense. So, along with all of the colleagues who are doing this work in Mexico, I think we're building a picture of this world, piece by piece. So there are certainly folks who have focused on this. Maria Esther Perez Salas has a work on costumbrismo and lithography, which might be a good place to start. And one of the things that I hope that the book can do is to allow readers who are mostly working in an Anglophone canon of scholarship to think about a broader hemispheric community of scholars working on printing history as well.
We have another question from Christy Patrov, and she is very excited to read the book, and she's interested specifically about the circulation of printed materials. And her question is, was there a special relationship between print and the postal system in Mexico? Were printers also postmasters? Were printed materials also able to circulate through the mail at discounted rates?
This is a great question. I don't think in the 19th century that printers doubled as postmasters. I do know that they were constantly complaining. There's a lot of complaints that shuttle back and forth. And one of the sources that I worked with, the sort of source bases I worked with, were government records associated with the production of the official gazette and government materials, where you can see the kind of complaints about the logistics of trying to disseminate materials through the post office, blaming, the printer blaming the post office blaming the printer, and the officials blaming everybody for not getting the newspapers to the appropriate places in a timely fashion, or having them be destroyed along the way. So I think there is, challenge. I don't know the issues about franking and how exactly that worked. But I think that, so I'm not sure how to answer that. I know that in the US, like we think of Franklin and the postmaster thing, but that's not a relationship that I've seen in the Mexico case.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question or two. So if there's anybody out there that would like to submit their question and haven't yet, please do so. I'm, of course, always interested in printers and folks that are practitioners and how they view printed materials perhaps differently than those who are non-practitioners. You've mentioned that you come from a family with this background. You were trained as a letterpress printer yourself. And I should just kind of note that your book really offers this really amazing and intimate look at the 19th century print shop. You mentioned the smells that are emitted into the neighborhood. You mentioned the inky residue on compositors' hands and washing stations. You talk about the presses and types and equipment that shops owned, and even at one section talk about the spatial configuration, especially in regards to the national print shop. Could you tell us a little bit more about your training and how that's really kind of influenced your work on this project and the way that you approach reading printed materials?
Yeah, I learned printing in a post-apprenticeship world, right? So I don't know, I can't do a one-to-one, imagine myself in the shoes of these compositors. I do think, I learned through a lot of, through classes and from conversations with other printers in the Center for Book Arts space. And one of the things that I really think about a lot and wonder about because of my own experiences is about that social component, right? The printing shop is this really social space where you solve problems, right, in conversation with others, where you get advice, where you learn from other people's expertise, where you gossip, where you complain about your impossible jobs or impossible clients, or talk about things that are going well. So I think that sort of awareness to the ways that this, the sort of hierarchies, right, that go into it. When you're a job printer, you have to do what the boss, the person who's paying says. You don't always have opportunities to express yourself creatively in ways that you might want to. And there's a sort of tension and a negotiation, right, that goes into producing that I think informs some of my speculation, the more speculative parts of trying to understand that social world. And yeah, the thing about the fingers, the hand, the way the ink dust sticks to your fingers, that is, I guess that's all me, because it's just like you feel the residue of the ink sticking to you. I mean, maybe it's different and given different ink compositions and things like that. So I won't get too technical about it, but certainly thinking about production and knowing that there are constraints around what you can do, that there are also areas where you can exert your creativity, I think informed the way I approach documents, and certainly my experiences working in a printing shop as a sort of social space is what informed some of my research questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have more questions arriving, so I'll try to combine these if possible. Could you talk a little bit about the use of articles from around the world in, I'm assuming, newspapers, especially from Europe? How acceptable was this in Mexico? And then we have a related, maybe less related question. How might we rethink our ideas about intellectuals in the 19th century to consider printers into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly reprinting is very common in the 19th century. And you have, I mean, this is true, I think, hemispherically, that there's a lot of borrowing and it's not seen as problematic. It's part of the kind of way you fill your newspaper columns. It's the way you bring exciting content to your readers, and printers figure out, really capitalize on that and use it to construct their persona as these kind of cosmopolitan intermediaries who bring the world to a local audience, right? So that's part of their sort of self-positioning and presentation as cosmopolitan or cultural, purveyors of culture. So they take on a sort of editorial or publishing kind of function in that way, where they talk about themselves or they write letters to their own newspapers, so that they can sing their praise, all the ways in which they try to create a public image of themselves around their activities as cosmopolitan intermediaries. And yeah, I think I think that including printers in the space of what is an intellectual is an interesting one, because they're figures that are connected to the world of manual labor, but they are literate workers. They are sort of their importance. They make claims about their own importance based on their relationship to words. So they have this kind of ambivalent relationship. I mean, they're not the kind of, they don't necessarily, I mean, I'm sure some do certainly, but they're not necessarily trumpeting work as the sort of liberating idea. It's sort of about becoming, getting to use and engage with ideas that is the freeing dimension of their job, right? So being literate workers, I think, puts them in a really interesting space where they both blur the categories between the manual and the intellectual, but they also have their own kind of perspective on what should be celebrated, right? Did they celebrate themselves as workers? Not as much as they celebrate the act of transcendence that happens when you have access to words, right? So I think it's an interesting way to think about how in the 19th century, when social hierarchies are, the basis for who gets to participate is in flux, right? It's not about your birth, but it's about your education. So when that transition is happening, printers are in a position to sort of push back against that as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. I have a whole list of questions I haven't gotten to regarding readership and literacy and authorship. And I can go down this list, but I think the sign of a good work is that how many wonderful questions it raises. And I think we've done that today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That was really fun.
I hope our audience in the chat, thanks Corinna for joining us today for a wonderful talk. I would like to conclude our program with that. As a reminder that this talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks, and I will email you about that soon. I encourage attendees today to complete the evaluation that is included in the chat. You can check out future AAS programs by signing up to our History of the Book mailing list, so please do that. We do have a really robust lineup in the coming of upcoming programs. I want to just remind you all very quickly. Tonight at 7 p.m. we have the program Where Are the Birds? Rediscovering and restorytelling the landscapes of John James Audubon with Krista Elric in conversation with Gregory Nobles. On Monday we're hosting Recovering the Lost Years of John Peters and Phyllis Wheatley Peters, featuring Cornelia Dayton in conversation with Henry Louis Gates. And our next book talk is scheduled for November 18th and features Elizabeth McHenry, who will discuss her new book, To Make Negro Literature, Writing, Literary Practice, and African-American Authorship. So please join us for those. I look forward to seeing you there. As always, thank you for attending.